All right, thank you, and welcome to Mini Hothouse C. This is mining government data to reach target 8.7. I'm Anjali Mazumder from the Alan Turing Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence in London, UK. We've got three great panelists here. So we've got, I'm gonna go through this. Louis Fabiano de Assis, yep. Right? From the SmartLab in Brazil. Clare Gollop from the UK National Policing Modern Slavery Transformation Unit. And Julia Kocis, thank you, from Lehigh County Regional Intelligence Center close by in Pennsylvania. So just before we get started, we said this hothouse is not supposed to be hot in its temperature, but I realize there's a fair few of us in a small room. And I guess I have to say, from my perspective of a hothouse, I've done this where, as expert witnesses, we're sort of forced into a room. When you've got expert witnesses from the defense side and the prosecution side, and they're told, you need to sort this out, right? And you can't come out of the room until you've got a solution. You come to an agreement on whatever that scientific evidence was, or the information you're passing forward. So I'm not sure that's what we're trying to do, but I think what we hope to do is hear from our presenters and sort of scope out potential pathways to solutions or opportunities here. So I think we've already heard there's a multitude of sources of data, and the government is in fact can be seen as a great treasure trove to such data and data that could be harnessed. But there are also very practical challenges on how to do that. There can be archaic database systems. There can be challenges from a legal or ethical perspective, or the sensitivity of some of this data and privacy issues on how we do this, as well as the computational issues. So I think we're probably going to hear a little bit about some of those and how we can mine this data, though, ideally at possibly different levels. So from a strategic point of view for policy, informing policy, but also from operational needs. So I'm not going to blather on any further, and I'm going to pass it over to our presenters here. But just before I do, I would love to get a sort of a show of hands of how many people are sort of from the anti-slavery trafficking community, from the sort of domain or policy side. Great. And how many from sort of the technical side? All right. Got a fair both. No reason why we have to be a complete divide there. Okay. I'm going to hand it over now to Lee, right?
So, thanks for having me. I'm really excited.
Here.
Sorry. May I use yours?
Of course.
Hello. Okay. Well, thanks for having me. I'm really excited, to with this opportunity of receiving inputs and feedbacks from you from both fields, right? The human trafficking and the tech. And as a prosecutor that I am, and a computer scientist as well, I try to, make connections between both fields. And it's really challenging for making connections involving people from, different fields, but it's really helpful when it comes to dealing with new ways of solving the problems that we have on a daily basis. So I'm going to talk about how we are, do you have the slides available? Maybe. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're going to talk about how we are using computational science and where we see opportunities for using machine learning and AI. We're going to talk about some experiments we did there in Brazil. And these are some of the questions we set out to address concerning the problems that we deal with in Brazil, mostly, you know, the traditional prosecution business, and there we are tasked also we're tasked with monitoring the effectiveness of public policies. So this is basically our perspective. And we know that machine learning is not magic, right? Some people think that machines are going to, you know, perform do new things, do their best to change the world and come up with insights we never had before. But the truth is, there's no magic with statistics, with econometrics, with economics, etc. So we're just exploring new computing possibilities and power, and to do things that we wouldn't be able to do before without computers and algorithms. So it's using machine learning and AI is really useful for us to explore data on a large scale, to make connections, to connect the dots in relation to things that that we didn't manage to you know, questions that we didn't manage to answer before because we didn't have the means of doing so. So of course, another caveat important that we're focusing on predictions. We're not focusing on causation. We're focusing on correlations mostly. Most machine learning cannot be used for statistical inference and causal investigations. There are some experiences recently that are trying to grapple with these things to sort of change the algorithms for making them more adapted to causal investigations. And, well, we in Brazil, we live in a very disorganized ecosystem, as you might you know, think. A very disorganized, a very inefficient bureaucracy. I'm a part of the government, but fortunately, I'm from a public independent government body. I mean, we're not political appointees, and when the government changes, they can't fire us. Say, hey, you're out, because this is really fortunate for a country like Brazil. But the fact is, we need a lot of risk prediction and resource allocation, and those are both very important fields for us to use machine learning and artificial intelligence. So we're envisioning using the machine learning and AI and the development of tailor-made policies to define who's going to be inspected based on the reportings we receive, based on the data we have, which municipality we should be prioritizing in terms of resource allocation, and how we can analyze the policies in place according to the resources they're allocating to a specific location, and what are the criteria that they're using. The criteria can be confirmed using the data we have. I'm going to show you some examples of these things. And of course, we're sort of trying to develop tailor-made policies and to check whether or not the policies, can have means of predicting the risk. We're focusing on specific vulnerabilities. In addition, we're trying to improve our decision-making process. We can allocate inspectors and law enforcement much more efficiently doing so, prioritizing risky places for inspections according to the data we have. And the more we discover, the more we predict, the better the predictions will be. In addition, I'm going to show you some examples of how we're trying to eliminate unnecessary interventions. I mean, where are we going, what we're doing that we shouldn't be doing, the places where we shouldn't be going. I'm going to show you some selections of pieces of information that are more likely correlated to behavioral changes. I mean, I see a lot of potential for using machine learning and AI to track these things. For example, the municipalities and states in relation to which we've issued information on the observatory, they want to talk about it. You know, they call us to say, hey, I saw my name in your platform. I saw my name on the press, and they're talking about me, about I'm a hotspot. My state is a hotspot. My municipality is a hotspot. You're naming shaming me. No. You are naming shaming yourself. I mean, let's do something about it. So this is something that we, they think they will be likely held accountable if they, everyone is having access to information about what's going on there in the places where they govern. I mean, the communities. And again, focus on the local level. This is really important. This is key. We're putting up competitions, partnering with universities. I mean, there's a university there in Brazil, in the same state where you saw that crazy disaster, the Vale disaster, right? Minas Gerais. And there's a university there that the computer science students, they were dealing with data sets concerning stars movements, you know, and they just called me and told me something like, hey, we need the data set of a real world problem. And we just de-identified the data according to our safety data security protocol, using the best standards in terms of the identification, and then we gave them the data set for them to think about you know, their algorithms, and they're doing their research with the real world problem. So, and we did this with like 3 or 4 universities, and they're producing a lot of things that might be useful for us as a law enforcement agency to monitor policies in place as well. And you see, we didn't spend money here. We're just making the information flow and putting the information out there. Of course, I'm going to give you some example of how we're sort of trying to improve government statistics to check, you know, to pull all the data we have together and try to figure out opportunities for reducing data gaps. And of course, we want to check if the policy is effective, but some of these questions are causal. So off-the-shelf machine learning won't work at all. I mean, they will not fully address the problem of resource allocation I'm alluding to. Well, so there are a lot of data out there, places in relation to places where victims of human trafficking were rescued, in relation to vulnerabilities, as we call at the human development level, the places where they were born, they spent their entire life there, and or they migrated because they didn't manage to live there because the life there is terrible. Data concerning vulnerabilities at the socioeconomic level, concerning locations where victims live or lived with their families and where they might be recruited, concerning profile of the victim, supply and demand indicators, economic sectors, etc. And we started to collect the data in our project. Basically, human trafficking databases to track the cases. We are using a very interesting data set concerning unemployment insurance that is paid to victims of human trafficking, that the victims that are rescued, a very reliable database in relation to the, because the government acknowledges that those cases are human trafficking cases, mostly labor trafficking, but we have more recently cases of sex trafficking as well. Databases from the judiciary, prosecution, police, inspection, NGOs we're partnering with. Even though they have, you know, de-identified data, we sort of try to collect the data even so. We're not, you know, we're sort of trying to take advantage of all of these opportunities. And other sources, non-traditional sources to track vulnerabilities. Census data, service data, academic assessment given to children in school about, you know, that has a piggyback survey concerning whether they work out of, and for how many hours a week. Migration databases, databases concerning cash transfer programs in Brazil. And interestingly, you might think only in Brazil we're going to find those databases, which is not true. For example, the cash transfer programs we're going to find in out of 132 low and middle income countries, you're going to find cash transfer program. A lot of them with conditionalities in 130. I mean, we're going to find cash transfer programs in 132 countries in the world. Most with conditionalities. I mean, at least half today with conditionalities. In 97, it was 2, 28, 27, and 2015, 64. I mean, in Brazil, we have this Bolsa Família, which is a rich database, 14 million families, 80 million people, and cash transfer conditional on children attending school and receiving primary health care. And you see here that we're sort of trying to track vulnerabilities. And one of the first things we did was to deploy all of these databases into in a connected way into our data platforms to split the perspectives into, for example, here we have on the green dots here, we see the perspectives of the places where the victims were rescued. On the red dots, those are totally different places. We see the places where the victims were born, and these the places where the victims were rescued. So those are three different policies, totally different policies. If you want to reduce vulnerabilities concerning human development level, you have to focus on the red dots. You have to improve law enforcement resource allocation and risk prediction. You have to focus on the green dots, and if you want to focus on vulnerabilities to recruitment, for example, you have to focus on the blue dots to start. And well, this is the storytelling platform I've alluded to, and we're plotting different indicators. For example, there we have a set of municipalities, and we managed to compare the municipalities of a specific state according to different characteristics, and we can use lots of different layers to check the similarities and the resource allocation that should be improved in a specific location, and to find things like this. For example, in a specific municipality in Brazil called Codó, you see the time series here. We're going to find lots of rescues with just a few inspections, and a lot of inspections, just a few rescues. I mean, it's an opportunity for improving the resource allocation in relation to the risk prediction. Which should be the municipalities where I should be focusing my attention on. And I mean, we're almost out of time. Okay, I'm almost finishing. We're doing a lot of analysis concerning specific locations to select the indicators that most likely will predict the risks. And then we're using these indicators to embed some domain knowledge into our algorithms, into our risk prediction mechanisms. Well, this is the first study we did using machine learning algorithms to combine to sort of assess the risk concerning the likelihood of an inspection being successful, concerning the risks that we've assessed, combining all the data sets I've alluded to, some selected indicators. It's a supervised machine learning thing. We're also using the same approach to track vulnerabilities concerning the commercial sexual exploitation in Brazilian highways, using cases of rescued children and adolescents from the Brazilian highways by the federal police in Brazil. So we're sort of trying to predict the risk concerning specific highways, specific clusters of municipalities, specific locations. Well, this is an interesting case where we've used a lot of databases to find missing data gaps and to track to design migratory routes concerning Latin American countries. And we didn't have the data set, but we managed to produce a new data set that predicts the most frequent migratory routes within the Latin America to Brazil in the specific locations where we have lots of cases. Well, that's an overview. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Louis. So I'd like to take just 5 minutes now to sort of start questions, and then we will have time again afterwards. But if we could just get started.
I just have a question about.
Sorry, could you speak up just
Yes.
a little bit louder?
I have a question about what's driving the predictors of risk. So, are you basically pulling data that's readily available and low-hanging fruit, and then building a model of predicting occurrences? I guess I'm wondering, is there a theoretical framework to any of the risk prediction model that you're using?
Yeah, well, like 90% of the cases of human trafficking in Brazil are correlated, the victims are poor. So we're sort of selecting the indicators according to this, the characteristics that are more usually found in the victim. So here we see, for example, we're using a lot of human development indicators such as this is the cash transfer program that we've used as a proxy to measure poverty and extreme poverty in all of those specific locations. And the basic idea here, as a law enforcement agency, I don't have the analytical skills and the skills of a high-skilled statistician or economist, but the thing is we've managed to improve our resource allocation in terms of law enforcement and inspection only by looking at the hidden patterns that are correlated with poverty in the places where we're receiving the denounces from. So we've received like 100 denounces in a specific month, and the question was, okay, what kinds of questions we should be asking about the social protection network in those places? What kinds of questions we should be asking about the law enforcement resource allocation to those places? So the drivers for assessing the risks are basically those correlated with the characteristics of the municipalities where we are finding more frequently the cases of human trafficking in Brazil.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Can you talk about your feedback loop in your predictive models and how you're incorporating the results of your predictive models? Can you talk about how you're incorporating the feedback into those models to validate those models and continue to learn from them?
Yeah, we have just started to use, like, we have the cases, the facts concerning the rescues that we've made, like since 2003, the Brazilian government did. And basically the idea is to use those facts and to combine them with the set of indicators that we've selected to explore correlations. It's at early stages yet. We're more worried about the basic things, you know, for example, that example that I've shown you about lots of inspections that were being made in places where we were not finding anything. We were finding no victims there. So we're sort of trying to experience, as I told you, where I see a very huge potential for using machine learning are these cases here for risk prediction and resource allocation. And I don't have final examples of the things, but these are things that we're exploring using, for now, off-the-shelf solutions such as random forests and things like that, using the expertise of my team for them to use these machine learning algorithms, working with the set of the indicators of poverty and of characteristics of the victims and of the locations we've managed to rescue victims for us to assess the risks concerning other locations with similar characteristics.
All right. If you don't mind, we're going to hold off on further questions, but hold on to them because we will get back to them. And we're going to have Clare now. So. Might need to scroll through the end of.
Sorry. One moment, sorry.
Oh, the other way.
Oh. I'm not proving that I'm good at tech at the moment. That's me. Yeah, this is us. Okay, that's great. Sorry about that, everyone. Hello, my name is Clare Gollop. I'm the Programme Director for the National Police Chiefs Council in the UK's policing portfolio for modern slavery and organised immigration crime. I'm going to talk to you just for a few minutes today about the way in which we've tried really to set the foundation for stronger learning about modern slavery and how it presents in the UK. I think perhaps we're getting ready to be working with the data on a much bigger scale now, and so it's probably quite a useful time for us to be learning from you about what to do best next. So it's not a high-tech response that I'm demonstrating, it's kind of more what kind of data is it possible to achieve if you gather it in a purposeful way in terms of government responses. So just to, the other way. Sorry. This one here, okay. So just to set the scene then, in terms of the police service in the UK, it is a very complex landscape. We have 3 different legislation in place. We have different laws in place in Scotland, different laws in place in Northern Ireland, and different laws in place in England and Wales, all of which do now respond to modern slavery and human trafficking. And they have a lot of commonality, but they will call things different things. So data matching and data pictures across the whole of this service is quite complicated to achieve. In addition to that, if we just look at England and Wales, which is the part of the UK that I represent, we have 43 different police forces. That means we have around 86 different strategic leaders, all of which it's really important to influence if you want to improve the landscape in relation to modern slavery. So we have elected police and crime commissioners who are responsible for working with local communities for really bringing community ownership of problems, for commissioning victim support services in certain areas, and for developing stronger partnerships in this space. And then we have chief constables who are responsible for defining the operational response and resourcing in relation to law enforcement investigations. Now, in some police forces in the UK, there'll be dedicated modern slavery and human trafficking teams. In others, and in most places, actually, that either falls between serious and organised crime responses and between public protection responses. Because the two have very different areas of traditional focus, we find that the data is much stronger about offenders in the serious and organised crime influence kind of teams, and where the focus has been much more on victims and victim support, then you tend to get that picture, and rarely did the kind of two come together strongly. We have 10 regional collaboration units where police forces group together to work together on the problem. Those aren't kind of command and control relationships. They aren't data, they don't have the same databases even inside those regions. And in any one of those police forces, you probably have to look at about 20 different IT systems in order to pull the key information that you'd need to try and understand what the problem looks like locally. So it's a very kind of segregated data system, and quite a challenging one in which to affect any change. The National Policing portfolio for modern slavery. So we have around 200 portfolios. It basically means a chief constable and a support officer like myself speaks on behalf of the 43 forces about any one particular issue, and we work closely with kind of legislators, with parliamentarians, with other government departments, and with other law enforcement agencies in order to try and give a consolidated kind of response from policing. We also have the National Crime Agency, who deal with our kind of high-end, high-sophistication crime, and we have some really exciting things going on in that space. I'm not going to dwell on that too much in this presentation, primarily because in the UK, 85% of our investigations tackling modern slavery are happening in local police forces. So the bulk of the high-harm, high-volume cases is actually happening in less sophisticated kind of offender hierarchy networks, and being dealt with at quite a low level inside policing, which means that the information about it is also buried right in the heart of that diagram, really, inside all those police forces. I can speak a little bit across the whole of the law enforcement response in relation to policing, because recognising that local forces do an awful lot of that work. The National Policing Portfolio also chairs the National Threat Group on behalf of the NCA. So that's an organisation or a forum which brings together all of the law enforcement agencies inside policing to try and develop a really consolidated and closely knit response to the threat. It's an absolutely vital forum to make kind of really informed decisions about policy in. And one of the first things that we noticed when we actually established the threat group was that all of the policy leaders in different law enforcement agencies were being briefed independently about the threat, and the threat looked totally different to them all as a result. So when you have this very broad spectrum of exploitation that shows up in different ways to all of the different parts of law enforcement that are trying to do something about it, it seems to us at the moment most common that one law enforcement agency will identify that something is changing, but they won't be the ones that are charged with or responsible or even notice that they could do anything to prevent or to change it. So interagency cooperation and swapping of information understanding is incredibly important in this space. When we first started the National Threat Group in 2016, all of the law enforcement analysts who were working on modern slavery in the UK could fit in the back of a London taxi. That isn't an analogy. I have done it with them on multiple times. So we had really poor segregated data, and we had not very many people focused on looking deeply into it. And as a result, our learning wasn't moving forward very quickly. So just to touch really on what drives our kind of response inside policing, I think at the absolute heart of the National Police Service's response here is a very strong belief in survivors and that whilst they are very vulnerable at the point in which we encounter them, they are absolutely and undoubtedly kind of some of the strongest people that we will encounter. And I know that many police officers from our toughest kind of teams would openly say that they would struggle to walk a day in a victim of modern slavery kind of life. So we have tried very hard to take a very holistic picture of what happens to people to get them into that position, how they end up in that position, how they encounter the offenders, how the offenders themselves end up in that position too, and what's creating this kind of holistic sort of set of situation. And we're trying very hard to prevent that from happening. So we're responsible for dealing with something once it's started, but we'd really like to gather information in a systematic way about the whole of that context of exploitation in order to kind of move our intervention points as far to the left as we can. So 2016 was when the police transformation program was established. At that point, we had a small number of very high-profile cases of modern slavery and human trafficking. We had brand new legislation and a widespread support across government to try and do more in this space, but we didn't really know what doing more looked like. And the only thing that we had to guide our understanding of the threat at that point in time was this small number of cases that we didn't know if they were the norm or if they were kind of outlying cases. And we also had kind of a victim support services kind of register of who was accessing victim support in this space. And one of the things that was very clear to us from the beginning is that this victim support, people who were accessing the victim support service didn't look the profile there didn't look the same as the harm that was being experienced by law enforcement. Everything was kind of a mismatch between anecdote and experience and the hard data. So we were struggling to define how do we get better at this. So the police transformation program was established. We have taken a really conscious and deliberate decision to not invest that team of 70 purely in a squad to go after offenders in this case and to in this space and to deal with individual cases. We chose instead to invest in trying to understand the problem better, and we recognised it's going to take a long time to do that. So my kind of first message in relation to mining government data is that you do have to gather this data with purpose. It will cost human time and money at the beginning, and then there will be hopefully great opportunity to use the skill set we've got in the room to really harness that. So that's just an indicator on the slide there of the different types of places where we've invested in learning and in improvement. There's a website coming up at the end of the presentation with much more detail about what all of the teams do. So, sorry, go. So I just wanted to focus briefly on the analytical teams that we've put in place. More than half of those 70 staff are in analytical teams, and this gives you an indication of where there are probably data opportunities or things we could do differently. I'm going to start at the very bottom of the slide, having kind of really reinforced how important the force level response is. So we've reached out and trained over 500 analysts and researchers across England and Wales in recognising slavery and exploitation for what it is when they see it. And that is absolutely vital for us to do, because the majority of modern slavery investigations that we deal with that don't start with a victim presenting or being identified, and rescued or recovered, but that start in a proactive way, they start because of call to the police about antisocial behaviour. They don't start because people are ringing and saying, I'm concerned for the welfare of a person. They start because people are talking about the risk that they see and identify as antisocial behaviour. So crowds of people, entering brothels, traffic problems, litter, and so on. Just to take you really quickly then through the other teams, we've also established a team working within Europol. Quite a tricky thing for me to talk about right now at this particular point in time for the UK. But we have found with more connections to international investigations in our domestic exploitation. So harm that happens here in the UK between British nationals still has an international component, and swapping and exchanging data and information is really important. We've also invested heavily at a regional level in transformation team analysts who are looking at the local picture, what's normal and what's not normal in a particular area. And they're doing that using partly unstructured data and intelligence and information. They're partly using demographic data. They're partly using information that is about the local labour market, maybe, and things like that. And they've been funneling information up to us in the National Policing Insight team, the team above it. This team pulls together the data from the 43 forces, and we've been able to kind of, for the first time, look at police data on a really big level, but understanding context and contextual information. So we have information about the victims and the offenders, and the context in which they interacted, the context in which the intervention took place that stopped the exploitation happening, on now 2,500 different operations that have happened in the UK since the programme began. That's a richer source of data than we've got for any other kind of crime in the UK apart from terrorism. And it's a really good start, I think, for what we might work with next. And then just to kind of finish, I suppose, with the Joint Slavery and Trafficking Analysis Centre, this is probably the most public of our teams. This is a team that solves that problem of the London taxi that I was talking about earlier. So we've managed to establish for a 5-year funded period analysts from Border Force, from Immigration Enforcement, from Gangmasters Licensing and Labour Abuse Authority, from the Police Service, and from HMRC, which is our kind of tax and revenue inspection teams, to work together on policy briefs and strategic intelligence assessments. They're joined very regularly by embeds from military intelligence and from the security services. Still very law enforcement focused. We desperately need to move that now into other government partners and agencies. Those teams are pulling structured and unstructured information together, and trying to test hypotheses and try and understand what we might be doing better. And I can give some examples of that maybe in the questions if that helps.
Thank you, Claire. All right, so we'll take a couple of questions from the audience, or if there are questions from audience members online too. Does anyone want to start things off? Oh, sir.
How this, sorry, I mean, do you have any intuitions about how these 4 teams comes about? Is kind of, yes, you know, why there's an insight team and then there's a separate analytic. I mean, is it evolutions or is it like a by design? I can't quite see how the 4 different focuses.
So it's all by design because none of them existed before we set it up. And what we've had to do is go where the data is, at the level the data is and can easily be shared, and then try and connect the learning from those teams together. So there were quite a lot of challenges in moving information between those different systems. So what we've kind of tried to do is group the analytical teams together at the level where they can have really broad access, and then get them working on the same problem from all of their different perspectives and their different data systems. It's by no means, I'll be the first to say, it's not how you would design something to be an efficient response. It very much reflects the localized nature of policing in the UK rather than a smart way of doing things.
So these are specifically modern slavery?
Yeah, they're all focused just on modern slavery and human trafficking.
Hi, thanks so much. What you're describing about the UK is not so different from what we see and the challenges we face in the United States with respect to law enforcement data. And I'm just curious if you could share some lessons learned around sharing data and how you're able to overcome some of those challenges.
Yes, I think it's absolutely crucial, isn't it, that law enforcement breaks out its understanding of the problem so that other agencies and other people can take action. And one of the challenges that we absolutely have in the UK is we have what we kind of call a collaboration of the willing around anti-slavery partnerships, which are kind of equivalent to what I've seen in your task forces here in the US. And that means we've got the people together who want to be there, who have a sense of what they want to deliver, not necessarily the people that you need in order to design effective interventions. So we have deliberately invested in that regional level in order to kind of build first those relationships and build the evidence that you need in order to bring those other people to the table. One of the most important things I think we've identified is that data that's gathered as a byproduct of your normal policing processes or your normal business processes in a law enforcement agency is probably not the most compelling data for other agencies to act on. So that context information has become absolutely vital to us, but we've had to invest in gathering it. It doesn't appear on your natural police force fields that you enter when you file a crime. So I think starting with those who you want to influence, working out where their points of interest in this are, and then going backwards to build data and collect data that will influence them is probably quite important. If we start just by going backwards into our old data, it probably is never very compelling to other agencies.
Thank you, Claire. I'm going to pass it off to Julia now.
I was never very good at judging.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me present on your panel. And our team is actually very excited to be at this conference today. And we're hoping that we can help generate some great discussion around how AI can help support some of the problems that we're identifying here today. So I'd like to speak to you about a challenge that we have uncovered in our law enforcement data in trying to extract human trafficking events out of our police incident narrative. So this is a good segue from what you were just talking about, Claire. And what seemed like an easy task at first turned out to be extremely challenging. But before I get into that, I want to give you an idea of who we are, where we're located, and what it is that we do. So the Regional Intelligence and Investigation Center, also known as the RIC, is located in Lehigh County, Pennsylvania. We are actually part of what is considered the Greater Lehigh Valley, which is made up of Northampton and Lehigh counties. Our location is important to understand because we are the third most populous area in the state of Pennsylvania, upwards of 700,000 people and growing. We are in close proximity to several major highways with less than an hour-and-a-half drive to two major cities, New York and Philadelphia. Our location has drawn investment by the private sector over the several years, which has resulted in a strong and steady population growth across the region. And while the economic growth has made the Lehigh Valley a great place to live, it has also afforded greater opportunity for the criminal element as well. A good example of this would be the influence that we see from street gangs coming in from the larger cities to recruit and set up their market, as well as traffickers bringing in their victims. So our two counties receive police coverage from over 40 different local police departments and the Pennsylvania State Police. Each of these agencies keep their own electronic records management system, and it was very difficult to share information across them because they were siloed at one time. And the effort to develop the RIC was led by Lehigh County District Attorney Jim Martin as a way to share this data, as well as to share the technology and analytics services that we provide at the center, because police departments would not be able to implement this or afford to maintain it on their own. So our purpose is to encourage collaborative investigative efforts between local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies, as well as providing investigative and prosecutorial case support. We have a team of analysts and investigators, as well as a custom-developed technology platform. It aggregates all of our local government data to support over 1,200 law enforcement users of our system. And our system also, or our center, assisted in analyzing forensic data in the first two convictions for human trafficking in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So that's a little bit about who we are and what we do. But actually getting to that point took a lot of heavy lifting. So our initial efforts in developing the center really focused on centralizing and aggregating all the law enforcement data from the 40 different police departments and our other criminal justice systems, as well as for allowing some federated search capabilities so we could pull back results from other state and regional systems, all from a single user interface. And we developed applications for situational awareness. We allowed for some key term and phrase searches across our police incident narratives. And then through experience and user feedback, we started to develop other systems, and our services began to grow as well. So we developed a gang intelligence database, a system to track and identify illicit drugs. We also developed a system that helps with the opioid crisis in our community. And the reason I'm telling you about these other systems is because as we just started to develop them, the challenges started coming to us on how are we going to start storing these data sources, because we needed to store them in a more fluid manner than what we had originally done with our other systems. We needed to be able to show the relationships and connections between the people, places, and things that we saw emerging in our data, yet still be able to translate that to our end users in a format that was easy for them to understand and digest. So to solve that challenge, we incorporated graph databases because they excel at handling complex and highly interconnected relationships, and they are now a focal point of our analytic systems. We also learned to use graph algorithms to help solve problems and show relationships more efficiently. So, for example, we can express which gang member has the most influence on a gang by showing his gang member node and then showing the degrees of closeness, separation, or betweenness from him and the other gang members within the gang. And this really gives us a better insight into the inter and intradynamics of a particular gang. And as we actually moved into the phase of using graph databases, we were able to mine further within our own data and get a better understanding of our criminal element. And now we're picking up on a completely new challenge within our data. So we're becoming more aware of human trafficking events based on what the data is trying to tell us, but the data is sitting in the unstructured free-form text of the police incident narrative. It's there, but it's really difficult to get at in an easy and efficient manner. It's basically hidden in plain sight, much like this dual image on the slide up here, much like the human trafficking victims themselves. So what we want to be able to do is identify victims so that we can provide them help and support services, identify traffickers so that we can investigate and prosecute, and then identify the buyers so that we can help deter and curb demand. And what we've noticed is that the existing coding methods fall short that we're using because police incidents use a method of classification called the Uniform Crime Reporting Codes. There is no crime code for human trafficking events. Even if there were, the nature of this classification system is hierarchical. So only the most serious event gets coded within an incident. And to prove that these incidents actually exist in our data, myself and another analyst conducted an experiment, and it took us a week to search for the term human trafficking in police incident narratives. And in that time, we were only able to read through 55 incidents because of the length of the narrative itself. And then we were trying to draw relationships and links between entities we discovered in the unstructured data to the entities that we discovered in the structured data of the same incident, and then map those entities from that particular incident out to other incidents within our data set. So it's not really a feasible way of getting at these cases. So dealing with unstructured and free-form text presents a completely new set of challenges to us. But to our credit, we did attempt some basic natural language processing techniques against our data, but we actually stopped short because we weren't quite sure what the results were being returned to us, and we didn't want to be irresponsible and end up creating something that we unknowingly coded bias into. So one of the first things we started doing was handpicking pre-coded incidents for our AI models to run against, and we thought, okay, this is probably not the best idea. We also didn't want to create an ontology based on our limited understanding of the problem. And we didn't want to over or underfit the machine learning algorithm based on what we currently knew, and then we would miss opportunities to learn what we didn't know. So we ended up forming a team of both subject matter and technology experts to help tackle this problem. And our team now includes Colleen Owens. She is the CEO of The Y. It is a nonprofit fashion company founded on sustainable and ethical design. She also served as a former senior research associate for the Urban Institute on Human Trafficking. Jennifer Long, CEO of Equitas. It is a nonprofit based out of Washington, D.C. They are the prosecutor's resource on violence against women. Dr. Daniel Lepresti, he is the chair of Lehigh University's Department of Computer Science and Engineering. He is also one of the hosts of this conference. Dan and his colleagues bring their expertise in artificial intelligence to our team. Shay Rhodes, she is the director of the Villanova Law School's Institute on Commercial and Sexual Exploitation. She brings her legal expertise on Pennsylvania laws related to sex trafficking and Computer Aid Incorporated. They are a leading technology company in our region, and they've been a partner of the RIC since our inception. They helped us develop our software systems. So our idea, and it's still forming, and it's open up for discussion, is to run some AI models against our unstructured and structured data to identify entities, list how these entities are related, identify reoccurring themes within the narratives, and then classify the records into different categories for easy retrieval. So the system will label why a particular record was selected for review as a human trafficking event. It will present it to an analyst who will give us feedback, and then we're going to take that feedback, put it back into the model. We'll run it through several iterations to help train the model. So it's kind of a human-in-the-loop artificial intelligence system. And then once we feel that the model is in a good state and we're confident on the events being returned to us, then we can put some law enforcement actions around what the data is trying to tell us. Then we will be in a better position to help victims, investigate and prosecute traffickers, and hopefully deter buyers. We are currently in the process of seeking funding to help develop the system. We received some private funding to develop a human trafficking response protocol and potential funding for a facility to help treat and support victims once we identify them. We are taking a collective impact approach to this initiative by including cross-sector partners in academia, criminal justice, technology, healthcare, law, and the social services. We kind of feel that they need to be part of these conversations up front before we start developing a system that might have the unintended consequence of overwhelming their systems and resources once we can start identifying victims with some regularity. Whatever we develop, we hope to make it scalable and adaptable for other agencies to use because we would like to be able to pay it forward. We think that that's the responsible thing to do. We do anticipate training for all of the partners involved in this project because we need to develop some common terminology and language when we're attempting to identify and assess human trafficking events and its victims. And then lastly, we want to be able to report the outcomes of the project and then hopefully present it at future venues like this. So thank you.
Thank you, Julia. So I'd like to take a couple of questions from the audience, and then we'll open it up to the whole panel.
I'm just going to pipe in really quick. And anybody speaking on the mic, if you can speak directly into the microphone, it's really important so that people on the live stream can hear what's happening in the room.
Thank you.
Louise Shelley, George Mason University. When you're talking about gangs, I've been doing some analysis in Northern Virginia of our gang prosecutions and finding a very great difference in the operation of different types of gangs, so that Hispanic gangs are operating differently from Afro-American gangs. Are you finding that in your data?
In our gang data, yes. Yes, and we've actually identified gangs that are now turning to human trafficking, sex trafficking, because it's more lucrative than drug trafficking, and there's less consequences associated with it and less risk.
But I mean, within the human trafficking. what I'm saying is I was looking very specifically at different patterns of human trafficking between different gangs. Is that what you're finding?
No, not in our region, not yet, anyway. But like I had mentioned, we have seen that street gangs are turning more to human trafficking, sex trafficking, because it's more lucrative and less risk.
Thank you. I think Steve. Oh,
Hi, Amy Bruckman from Georgia Tech. I am in awe of the effort it took to get all those jurisdictions to pool their data. That's amazing. As much as having siloed data is brain dead, it also de facto provided privacy protection. What do you do to protect people's privacy in the new, more dangerous unified privacy data set?
Well, since we really haven't developed the human trafficking intelligence system yet, I can speak to what we do with our intelligence data regarding gangs. So when you end up in our intelligence system, it goes through a very strict vetting process because we have to follow both federal and state policies. So the individuals must meet a set of criterias, and it is a point-based system. Once they reach a certain threshold, they can be considered a confirmed gang member. They can remain in our system for 5 years. At 5 years' time, if we cannot find additional gang activity on the individual, we must purge them from our system. The same thing for someone who is considered an unconfirmed gang member. They must be removed from our system in 3 years' time if we can't find additional criteria to put them up to that 1.5 threshold.
Can I just follow up? I was thinking in particular of the sad recent case of a border control agent who used his official access for nefarious purposes, including rape and murder. You have a very sensitive data set, so how do you monitor its usage as well as who's present in it?
So we are able to audit everything that happens in that system. Anytime a user queries what they queried on, we save the criteria, the date and time. Everything is based on the user's account. We can do audit reports. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Hi, I'm Sir Huang Poon from University of Manchester. First of all, I'm not sure my request or question will be discussed tomorrow. It's huge amount of data and efforts and results already with different organizations, especially in terms of texture analysis, unstructured data. So my question is actually a request to see if it's possible to learn from your algorithm. Is it in public domain? Is it possible for us to learn from your training set in order to take us further at an international level? So we have US, Brazil, and the UK. So that is a very kind of, not sure whether it's too much to ask. The second things I just want to briefly mention and advertise for myself, especially for Clare. Nice to meet you here in US. We are actually working with the Greater Manchester Police. I'm sure I will very soon to be somehow get back to you at a more detailed level. So what we are doing here is within literally in 1 or 2 months' time, we are helping the Greater Manchester Police exactly the problem that you just described about the difficulty about communicating with each other, 43 constables, 43 police forces, etc., etc. So we are promoting a distributed ledger approach of using a hyperledger fabric blockchain to help them passing the information between each other. Just like what you said earlier, the user themselves don't necessarily need to understand the blockchain technology apart from the top level technicians. So exactly, we help them to communicate and help them in performing their task and producing the audit trail and follow the victims. So that is one idea that we are pushing forward. Because of the distributed ledger nature, it can propagate to different parts of the countries and to different parts of the world. And that is what we are working on. It's mainly a group of volunteer techniques, technical consultants working over the weekend. So that's as much as I will say just now. So if you guys have any suggestions or would like to participate, do get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. I do want to open it up to wider participant group, but just before I get started, we actually have a question from online from Patricia Hines. She's asking, could you elaborate on how you are connecting to social data care? Not sure if this is... we'll go across the panel because I'm not sure if this was directed to a particular panel member, but so maybe across the panel, I'd like to...
Okay, well, we do use... I'm sorry, you guys can't hear me, can you? We do use social media a lot in our investigations. Currently, we're only using it on a case-by-case basis. So when an investigation starts or a prosecutor is about to go to court and we need to find additional information on a witness or a victim or a defendant, that's when we start going after social media. But we do it manually. Our center uses analysts to do this. It's extremely time-consuming, especially when you're working an investigation, especially a human trafficking investigation. There's a lot of data that you have to mine through in a manual fashion, and it's just not a feasible way of going about doing it.
So actually, Julia, I'm just going to say it was actually social care data, not social media data.
Oh,
So that's fine. We also got some information about how social media gets used. So
Sure, I know what social care data is.
So I think, so if you think about sorry, just thinking. So if we think about situations in which maybe a child might be taken into care, or so if they're put at risk, so that kind of information. I'm taking that as an example.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
really
Claire probably
haven't worked with that type of data.
So one of the things that the Police Insight team has had a look at recently is cases of missing and exploited children. And this is a really tricky data set for us to pull together, all those reasons we've just been talking about. In 1 year, over a 1 year time period for data, we've been looking at 200,000 instances of kids going missing in the police forces in England and Wales. That includes 75,000 children and young people. And 5,000 of those we have kind of concern about, having combined data from police forces, from health, from social services, from education, and combine that with kind of anecdotal information and case studies as well. We've kind of found 5,000 kids that we're quite concerned about in relation to indicators of exploitation. Now, one of the things that looking at data, not just from a law enforcement perspective, but with this particularly social services and looked after children, so kids in care in the UK, when we looked at their data, what we found was that the kids that were going missing, or the peak ages, if you like, for kids going missing and getting involved in exploitation, when they turn up in police data sets, it's kind of mid-secondary age. So 13, 14, 15, 16 would be the kind of key time of concern. When we look at other agencies' data sets as well, for those 5,000 kids, we see they started going missing much earlier, and they started kind of exhibiting signs of concern much earlier. And this is leading us to really think about our intervention strategies in schooling and education. It's taken us a long time in the UK to just start talking about sex education in secondary schools in a really meaningful way in relation to exploitation and harm. And now we're recognizing we need to do it in primary schools, so ages 8, 9, 10, 11, or we're kind of missing the boat. I think that's just one example. But the problem with trying to bring the data together, data ownership and privacy, as the audience member has mentioned, but just sheer time and scale. You know, we need to kind of invest in answering a small number of specific questions really well, rather than just kind of knee-jerk reactions, which is where kind of law enforcement, ourselves absolutely included, often ends up having to service the kind of continual operational demand. So it does take dedicated units and resources and time and energy, I think, to answer those kind of questions.
Thank you, Claire.
Yeah, in relation to social care, it reminds me of the CSAC case where we had this data set concerning children rescued from Brazilian highways, and we realized that like 80%, 70 to 80% of the cases of the municipalities didn't have, for example, guardianship councils, which are structures of the state at the local level that are responsible for taking care of children, to making sure that they're going to school, that they're receiving health care and things like that. So there is a strong correlation between the lack of a social protection network and the places where the CSAC is more prevalent. I mean, the lack of police structure, law enforcement structure, but also the social protection network structure. So one of the things that are really useful for us is to geo-reference all of these data, focusing on municipalities as the most important unit of analysis, which is it's really helpful to find the gaps in terms of social protection network.
Thank you. All right. Steve.
Thank you. Obviously, due to the question of the panel, there's been a lot of focus on the analysis of data, and I was wondering if you could talk about any of your experiences of actually briefing the analysis to decision makers who may not have the domain knowledge to really understand the data, and particularly about sort of risks of people that may be misusing infographics that look great, but that people don't generally understand. So if you had any experiences or any thoughts on that.
Who wants to start?
So one of the things that has been really interesting and positive, I think, about our journey in UK policing's understanding this threat has been a desire from very senior stakeholders in government and in policing and across law enforcement to know more and to understand more. So the analysis and the kind of sense of a need for policy briefs and a need for stronger assessments has been coming from the top rather than pushed up. And as someone with an analytical background, that's really welcome. Now, what I have found is that has created time for senior leaders to clear time to actually understand problems better when evidence can be presented to them. I agree there is a lot of risk in oversimplifying the messaging, in this space. So one of the challenges we have in the UK is that modern slavery groups together, a vast spectrum of kinds of offending and different kinds of typologies of offending within that. And they all need tackling in different ways and interventions in different ways. But we kind of use it as a shorthand all the time. So I think what I have seen is that if you have to kind of keep breaking the problem down into small, specific descriptions of types of harm and the interventions that will likely work to solve them, and then bring it back up to where that sits in the great spectrum of it all. And unfortunately, that means you need to understand the whole lot really well. And our understanding is developing at a different pace in some areas compared to others. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Well, in terms of reaching out to the policymakers, this is one of the most important, questions that, parts of the work that we're doing, because we've realized that for most municipalities where human trafficking is highly prevalent, they have policies in place, but the policies, like for example in the state of Maranhão, they have a policy called More HDI. Like they want to raise the living standards there according to the HDI, the Human Development Index. One of the first things we started to ask them was which were the criteria you've used? You've used the regular HDI, or you've used for example the educational HDI. They're totally different. I mean, in terms of ranking the municipalities that should be prioritized. So the policymakers, they don't have those kinds of information. They just select just randomly the municipalities where they think the HDI is a good predictor as a criteria for resource allocation. And I totally agree that we might be making some mistakes in terms of selecting specific indicators, but they don't have nothing. They're using like their intuition, their rhetoric, the demands they receive, the letters they receive. Hey, you should be prioritizing my municipality. Oh, you're my friend. Hey, state governor, you're my friend. You should be sending money, more money from me. So they don't have any criteria. And one of the things that I think will be really helpful when showing any information in an infographic or things like that on a map is to focus on the indicators and things that might be explanatory for them to make a better decision. Because nowadays, at least in Brazil, 5,000 municipalities, they don't have nothing. What are the criteria they're using for making their decisions? I mean,
I'm going to kind of piggyback on what you just said at the end about showing that infographics in a map, and I'm just going to have a caveat that it's kind of dangerous sometimes to put data out there on a map, and it's going to be misinterpreted by a lot of different audiences. So there's going to be a lot of different types of policies have to be put around this type of data.
Hi, Brian Ulisny, Thomson Reuters. So I thought it was really interesting that Lehigh County is using network theory to do some of this analysis, and I was wondering, first of all, if the other groups were also using network analytic methods, and what kinds of challenges you have in sort of presenting and getting people to buy into these network-based analyses, since on the one hand we know that a lot of these crimes are very networked, but getting people to figure out which sort of centrality metric is the right one to use and what circumstances probably difficult.
So it's really tricky to try to display all that information back out to our end users in a visual way that is meaningful for them. When we first delved into some graph theory, we did stuff because we could, because we thought we were cool. We're kind of tech nerds. And what was being returned was this monstrous graph, and it meant absolutely nothing to me, so it's definitely going to mean nothing to a captain or a chief. So we had to tone it down a little bit, and then we had to really kind of, where we're at now is we had to bring in experts. That's why Dan Lopresti is now part of this group, and his colleagues, Jeff Heflin and Eric Balmer and Sihong Zi, to help us better display that information where it's meaningful to the users of it. I don't know if they...
Sorry, yeah, I totally agree, but one of the things that I've realized is that when we issue the information, so it making it public for everyone to have contact with a chart, for example, and they start raising questions. And you're going to see questions coming from people from different walks of life that you put together to talk about those charts. And then you will end up realizing that they're using different names for the same things. And the first thing that you can start doing is to discuss these things. I mean, what are the names that you're using for the same thing that I'm alluding to as some X, Y, or Z? And this is really important. When we started this project of doing this storytelling with the data we have, we knew that we would make a lot of mistakes, but we would like to receive the inputs from the people out there, from the policymakers, from the police officials, from law enforcement broadly, from the NGOs, from the non-profits, to see are those charts meaningful for them? To which extent we can improve our methods? Because if we don't start, oh, I'm afraid of something, and something's will end up being, I'm gonna make a lot of mistakes. My hypothesis is that we have to start to have meaningful discussions, not only here, but on a daily basis, with all of the people out there, with the policymaker, with the NGO, with the nonprofit, bringing them together to talk something that something might be wrong with the chart. But first of all, we have to have a conversation about what's going on what's going on with the chart in the first place, and build like a common taxonomy and a common names for start using the same names for the same things for us to have a meaningful discussions, because we won't have meaningful discussions otherwise.
Yes, in brief answer to your question, that we're using a lot of network analysis in terms of looking at these groups, and have been doing for, I would say, some 7 or 8 years, particularly in relation to CSE. That's been a really common thing in a multi-agency safeguarding hub environment within local forces in the UK. Where it gets trickier is when you start to combine information across the different force boundaries or different regional boundaries and try and understand what the problem looks like in its entirety. And it's difficult because the problem gets really big really quickly. So particular challenges about kind of using the network analysis are that the offending is by no means static in this kind of harm. So the actual harm that is being done and the relationships between people involved in that harm change over time. So you kind of need to show the network and show it over as it is evolving over time at different times in order to see the entirety of it. So, you know, for example, we see victims who do at times become offenders. We see offenders who then become victims of this or other kinds of crime as well. So it gets quite complicated and needs quite a lot of navigating to make sense when we build those cases. Another challenge is that some very important people in these networks are shadows. They're not really identified yet. The person who was rescued from a brothel setup knows there were 5 or 6 other people there, but they don't know who they were. So you end up with really high numbers of unknown people about which you just have descriptive information really quickly. So the other kind of shadows that you get, or the other kind of important people, are not victims or offenders, but they were people who in some way helped facilitate or enabled. And those people don't tend to be drawn from criminal data sets as easily. We don't record information just about people who happen to be involved around the vicinity of something as in a structured a way. So it's quite difficult to show the actual whole story in a way that helps interventions happen. And I think the other kind of point is that an awful lot of the slavery and trafficking that we see in the UK is not really big connected groups organised in a really hierarchical way, in the way that we might have expected when we started looking at drugs distribution or drugs trafficking. We see an awful lot of this harm that is loosely connected, groups of people, maybe familial connections, or just people who come from the same kind of culture, community, background, grouping in some way or another, who are taking advantage in the same way of a similar set of victims, but not because they're connected or sharing information. They're just exploiting the same loopholes and sort of social economic conditions. So you can get false connections in those groupings as well.
Thank you. I think.
As a practitioner in terms of programming for the last, 10, 20 years, working both in Brazil and UK and being funded by all you guys, I'm kind of curious, what are the industries or the commodities that you're finding? In Brazil, let's leave drugs out because I'm not sure that has anything to do with modern slavery. Are you finding it's plantations and coming down from Bahia? I mean, what's the industry? What's the commodity? And rather than the risk factors, because you can work on it when you understand what the commodity or industry is. In the UK, is it in fact children? And in fact, and as one of the largest commodities / industries markets, and may it in fact be children out of West Africa, which is what I think you were hinting at with your cultural question. So I'm kind of very curious, does your data tell you commodities, industries, markets, rather than individual Fred did this and so forth?
I'll just try and find one of the slides that I had to see if I can help a little bit with which I'm looking for. So just on the is it children? Is it children? Is it adults? I'm just going to flip between 2 different slides to try and answer the question. The first one is just look at the bottom there. That graph is showing us British nationals involved both as suspects and as offenders. It has grown massively. So we have in the UK, we started looking for a problem that was about people being trafficked from overseas, probably for sex. That's what we thought we were looking at, probably adults initially. that's how law enforcement was kind of established to look for this. And what we have found is that we have a very homegrown problem. Now, undoubtedly, people are being brought in, and those things all happen too. But we do have a very significant problem with British offenders offending against British victims, both adults and children. So in terms of the type of exploitation that we're seeing, this kind of the bar chart on the right shows that we're seeing kind of, we see an awful lot of sexual exploitation, and some of it is of children, an awful lot of it is of adults too, and a really dangerous kind of part of it for interventions is the kids that are growing into it. You know, they outgrow being in a CSC environment and they're moving into adult sexual exploitation or being exploited in other ways. But labour exploitation has always been head-to-head. However, we've looked at this over time, and whenever we go and look at it more. So when we, one of the very big cases in the UK, 15 years ago, we've just celebrated, sorry, that's completely the wrong word, we've just commemorated the Morecambe Bay tragedy, which led to the development of the Gang Masters and Labour Abuse Authority. Now that really shocked the UK. 23 young Chinese men drowned whilst cockle picking seafish, shellfish from the beaches around the north of England. They were completely kind of unknown to the community. It was one of those kind of completely hidden in plain sight sort of kind of harms. That led to an awful lot of looking at the migrant workers population, the agricultural population, and a lot of our early labour, our early understanding of labour exploitation was in that kind of space. Now we're looking much further, and what we're finding is it's in every kind of ununionized, high turnover, low control environment. We're finding it in care homes, in the care sector. We're finding it in the hospital sector. We're finding it in factories. We're finding it in situations where a person's being exploited and controlled in a completely legal workplace, where the people who are exploiting them and controlling them are not the owners of the workplace, but someone else is taking their wages and is controlling them. So it's really huge. It's really huge now is probably the answer. But we are starting to understand that it's huge. So the data is starting to show things that are different now.
Thank you. I think there was a couple of more questions. Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, may I use the... Yeah, your question is totally related to one of the, here. Well, here's the Amazon, right? So it's a matter of course, it's a matter of supply and demand. You're totally right. There are economic sectors that are demand for cheap workers in relation to labor trafficking, for example. So here are the places where the workers were rescued. On the red dots are the places where they were born. So one of the things that I've tried to emphasize that those are different perspectives. But if we focus on the industries, the commodities, as you alluded to, you're going to see a lot of charcoal production here to feed the steel industry. If you go to South Brazil, São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, you will see garment industry. If you go to Central West Brazil, you're going to see like meat packing industry. If you go to more Central Brazil, you're going to see a lot of cases concerning the construction industry. And there's this supply from workers to in relation to the demand coming from different economic sectors. You're totally right. But even if you tackle, for example, we were using a couple of months ago, so we've made an experience using tax receipts databases to look all of those people involved in trafficking cases of exploitation, who they're selling to, who were buying from them, and then we figure out lots of possible individuals and companies involved. But if we don't tackle the issues concerning the vulnerabilities, where the places were born, where the places where the workers where the victims born, where the victims live, we won't manage to solve the problem at all, because there will be new demand for them to work in different sectors. So, but your point is really important.
Thank you. I'm just going to take one more question before we wrap up.
Thank you. Felipe Arosvera with The Ohio University. I have, I guess, a question and a comment. One, I'm fascinated by the use of graph theory and network science to tackle this kind of problem. And I was wondering if you can elaborate on the gap between the technical terminology and the actual practice, prosecution, and how you can ground the subject in order to better understand and communicate these ideas with policymakers and law enforcement agencies and all the individuals involved in the industry. And second, regarding the structure of, I guess, modern day slavery, when we compare to, let's say, drug trafficking, it is true that kind of supply chain had a very unique structure, and it grew at a point that we couldn't actually control it. I feel that there were two main conditions why that happened. One is a multi-million or billion industry, and two, there was a person or individual able to coordinate everyone in the market. I feel that in modern day slavery, human trafficking, we have one of those conditions, right? We have the multi-million or billion industry, and maybe we just don't know the person who is leading the industry. So it is something that I guess graph theory can help us unveil.
I think the best way to show the benefit of that to policymakers and users is to wrap a story around it. So you can show a graph of an investigation. I'm going to use gangs again because that's what we've already developed, and we haven't really developed this application yet to find human trafficking victims. So you have a suspect in a particular, let's say, armed robbery. Nobody is speaking to police, even the witnesses on scene. Nobody wants to say anything. You put this gentleman, his node, on a graph, and you walk out his connections. Now you already have some leads. Now law enforcement can go and talk to those connections surrounding him, and they're going to have connections, and it's going to grow from there. And we actually did that with an armed robbery case where we caught the neighborhood rolling 20s Bloods, and it was one of the girlfriends of one of the guys that nobody would give up that we actually found on the graph, and we walked out his connections. They were able to speak with her and found out she was straw purchasing weapons for all the members of the gang to commit the armed robberies. And once we got her and her connections, then everything started falling into place, and they kind of fell down like dominoes. So that's really how you have to show the power of that technology through a story to get buy-in from the end users to actually use it, and from the policymakers to look at it and take notice, and then hopefully write policy around it in favor of it that still protects privacy. But one of the biggest challenges, I don't know if the rest of the panelists see this, is trying to write policy to keep up with technology, because we seem to be advancing so rapidly, but sometimes our laws are still way behind us.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I mean, I think the biggest challenge. Well, no, there are many challenges. They're all really big, but the drawing the boundaries, working out together with the investigators or the policymakers, where are the boundaries you're going to set on this network? Because actually, this is such a social, cultural problem that you can go very far into a person's life or their circumstances and still be finding relevant information and relevant connections. So I think that can be quite overwhelming for sort of senior investigating officers when we first start showing quite how widespread and embedded this issue is. In terms of kind of juries and the sort of prosecutors process, I think the sheer scale of some of these cases is leading people to rely much more on diagrammatic understanding of what they're hearing in front of them. So, you know, we've got at the moment, I think Europe's largest labour exploitation case is being held being heard in the UK. It has over 200 alleged victims involved in it and testimony about all of those people. So that's an awful lot for anyone to get their head around when they're just listening to it. So I think that is helping a bit.
Well, you alluded to network analysis and things like that, but one of the things that we're using network analysis to is to group together municipalities according to the characteristics in relation to places of origin, of destination, or both. I mean, there are municipalities that are both origin and destination. And the first time we've shown the chart for a policymaker, hey, see what's going on in your municipalities, it was a chart like this. And we were trying to explain, sorry, it's not on the slides, you know? This, and we're trying, oh, you're going to see blue are origin and destination, orange is origin, origin, and green is destination. And, you know, it took for us, you know, a lot of time for him to understand. So this is one of the reasons why we decided we have to figure out a way of better explaining, because he won't figure it out alone. And if we don't talk his language, if we don't achieve a way of saying things, of telling stories according to his way of thinking, because most policymakers are in sort of automatic mode in relation to the decisions they make. They receive the resources and they allocate the resources the same way over and over again without thinking what they're doing specifically. So it's a huge challenge, and this is one of the reasons why we're not, you know, now we want to explore machine learning, artificial intelligence. We're doing a lot of experiments, but we're focusing on the basic questions that we should be trying to address using the data that we've collected. Thank you.
Oh, thank you to our three panelists. We've heard from three panelists that are representing to some degree both the efforts and the challenges from three different countries around law enforcement and their efforts in this space. And I guess just to sort of draw out a little bit, we've heard the challenges in terms of how you harness data from disparate data systems or archaic databases, and also just the multitude of data sources. So whether that is social care data, combining that with crime data, healthcare, education, and thinking about how it's not just the administrative data, but also the unstructured data, and how we can better harness that. The challenges that this is a hidden population, how we might want to actually define what that means by a hidden population from a statistical perspective is also probably something that needs to be done. And also that this has both a spatial and a temporal sort of structure to it. And that we need to get at that municipal level, I think is what we heard. And I guess, so we've seen that there have been examples of that our panelists here and colleagues have been using network theory, but also a challenge of, as these data sources are large, the computational challenges in using network theory, in using NLP and text classification and other forms. And so I think there's a lot of computational challenges here, as well as the practical challenges. And I think what we also clearly heard is how do we not only use this for actionable, in actionable ways, but also communicate that to the policy people, sort of speaking a language in a way that they can interpret and make use of these tools and methods. So I encourage you to still discuss this and us to come together to see how we can move things forward in space. But thank you again to our panelists for all the great efforts that they're making and for coming and sharing their work.